There is a moment that happens in almost every family tree. A name repeats. Generation after generation, the same surname surfaces. In a parish register, a tax roll, a fading gravestone. And for a certain kind of name, that repetition is not an accident. It is a signature left behind by a world most of us have forgotten how to read, the world of medieval knighthood. Because surnames were not always just labels. In the centuries after the Norman conquest, a name could be a rank. It could be a job on the battlefield, a grant of land, a title stamped into a bloodline by a king who needed loyal swords more than he needed paperwork. Some of those names survived. They rode out of the Middle Ages and into modern phone books, disguised as ordinary words. This is the story of 12 of them, and what they may be quietly telling you about who came before you. Before we go further, it helps to understand why any of this is even possible. Surnames in most of Europe did not exist in a fixed, hereditary sense until roughly the 11th and 12th centuries. Before that, people were known by a single name, sometimes with a description attached, son of someone, from somewhere, known for something. As feudal society hardened into a structured hierarchy of lords, knights, and vassals, families needed a way to mark status and claim land across generations. A surname became a kind of institutional memory. It said, this family holds this fief, this family serves this house, this family fought and was rewarded. That is the accepted picture historians and genealogists work from. It is a reasonable one, and mostly it holds. But the closer you look at individual surnames, the more the story complicates itself. Not every noble-sounding name has noble origins. Some were adopted later, borrowed, translated, or simply invented by families hoping to sound grander than they were. Surname history is a field full of tempting shortcuts, and real genealogists tend to be cautious about them for good reason. So consider this an investigation, not a guarantee. What follows are 12 surnames with documented ties to medieval knighthood, along with the historical evidence and the uncertainty behind each one. The first is chevalier and its cousins chevalier and the anglicized chivalry-adjacent forms. The word itself is almost too on the nose. In Old French, chevalier means quite literally knight, derived from cheval, horse. A mounted warrior. Someone who could afford and had been granted the right to fight on horseback in service of a lord. Families who carried this surname into England, often after the conquest, were frequently identifying themselves by the very function that gave them status. Not every chevalier descended from an actual belted knight. Some acquired the name as an occupational marker generations later. But the linguistic root is undeniable, and in many documented cases, the name tracks directly back to mounted military service. Second, marshal. This one hides its meaning almost perfectly behind modern ears. A marshal today sounds administrative. In the medieval world, the marshal was one of the most powerful military offices a household could hold, responsible for horses, for organizing knights for battle, and in the grandest cases, for commanding armies. The most famous bearer of the title, William Marshal, rose from a minor knight to become one of the most celebrated warriors in English history, eventually serving as Regent of England. Families who took the surname Marshal were often descended from men who held that office, or served directly under someone who did. Third, constable. Like marshal, this began as a title of command. Specifically, the officer in charge of a castle's garrison and, in some cases, the entire military household of a lord. A constable was trusted with defense itself. The surname spread through England and Scotland attached to families who had held that responsibility, and it appears repeatedly in medieval military records tied to castle garrisons. Here is where the first real complication enters the story. Not every family bearing one of these names can trace an unbroken line back to an actual knighted ancestor. Surnames could be adopted by servants of a knight, by tenants on his land, or by families simply living near a castle associated with the office. The name marks a connection to knighthood, but the exact nature of that connection is not always the one people assume. This is the anomaly genealogists run into constantly, a name that looks like proof and might only be an echo. If you're the kind of person who likes discovering how ordinary details conceal deep history, This is a good moment to subscribe. There are far more of these hidden threads running through everyday names than most people realize. Fourth on the list, Fitzgerald, and the broader Fitz-family of surnames, Fitzwilliam, Fitzpatrick, Fitzhugh. Fitz derives from the Old French fils, meaning son of. These names were specifically used to denote legitimate or, in some interesting cases, illegitimate sons of Norman lords and knights, especially in Ireland and Wales after the Norman incursions there. The Fitzgeralds became one of the most powerful Anglo-Norman dynasties in Irish history, holding titles and land for centuries, with documented knightly service running through multiple branches of the family. Few names in English history carry more military weight. The Percy family, tracing to William de Percy, who arrived with the Norman conquest, became Earls of Northumberland and produced generations of knights and commanders, most famously Harry Hotspur, whose exploits were dramatized by Shakespeare. Carrying the Percy name historically meant carrying an association with one of the most battle-tested noble houses in English history, though, as with many aristocratic surnames, by the later medieval period the name had also spread to tenants, retainers, and unrelated families who adopted it through association with Percy lands. Sixth, Neville. Another Anglo-Norman name tied to a family that produced knights, earls, and warlords across centuries of English history, including key figures in the Wars of the Roses. The Nevilles were famous for their military households, meaning the surname could belong either to the noble bloodline itself, or to knights who served under Neville banners and eventually took the family name as their own mark of allegiance. Seventh, Talbot. The Talbot family produced one of medieval England's most feared military commanders, John Talbot, 1st Earl of Shrewsbury, whose reputation on the battlefields of the 100 Years' War was significant enough that French chroniclers wrote of him with something close to dread. The Talbot name is documented extensively in military muster rolls, a genuine paper trail connecting the surname to actual campaigns. This is where the science of names starts to resemble the science of genomes more than people expect. A surname, like a strand of DNA, is a kind of inherited code, passed down, sometimes faithfully, sometimes altered, sometimes borrowed from someone entirely unrelated. Just as geneticists have learned that ancestry rarely moves in a single clean line, genealogists have learned that surnames rarely mean only one thing. A name can be a genuine bloodline marker. It can also be a costume, adopted for prestige, protection, or convenience. The honest historian holds both possibilities at once. Eighth, Vavasseur. Less familiar today, but historically significant, a vavasseur was a specific rank within the feudal hierarchy, a tenant who held land directly from a great lord and was obligated to provide military service, often as a knight. The term appears throughout Domesday-era records and later feudal surveys. Families carrying the vavasseur name were, almost without exception, tied to this defined military landholding class. Ninth, bannerman, and its less common variant, banister, in some interpretations. A bannerman carried the knight's banner into battle, a position of trust and danger, since the banner marked a commander's location for both allies and enemies. It was not always held by a knight himself, but the role was embedded deeply within knightly retinues, and the surname followed that military function through generations. 10th, Standish. The Standish family of Lancashire held land through documented knight service for centuries, appearing in muster records tied to English campaigns in France and Scotland. Less globally famous than the Percys or Nevilles, but genealogically well documented, a reminder that decorated knightly ancestry is not only found in the grandest names in the history books. Sometimes it survives quietly, in regional families whose records were simply better kept. 11th, De Clare. One of the great Anglo-Norman families, the De Clares held vast territories and produced knights and earls who fought in major campaigns across England, Wales, and Ireland. The "da" prefix itself is a linguistic fossil. It marked landholding, a place a family was of, which in the Norman system was frequently inseparable from military obligation. Over time, many De Clare descendants dropped the prefix, and the surname fragmented into Clare and other variants, scattering the knightly association across branches that no longer wear it obviously. 12th, and perhaps the most quietly revealing, Armstrong. Unlike the Norman names on this list, Armstrong's origins are debated, with some tracing it to the Anglo-Scottish borders and a founding figure whose strength in battle, supposedly saving a king by lifting him onto a horse with one arm, gave rise to the name. Border reivers bearing the Armstrong name were feared warriors for generations, though the family's status sat outside the formal feudal knighthood of the South. Their story is a useful caution. Not every warrior lineage fits neatly into the chivalric framework historians built around Norman England. Some fought just as hard, just as long, from entirely outside that system. Which brings us to something important. These 12 names do not prove, on their own, that any individual descends from a decorated knight. Surname history is suggestive, not conclusive. Names were adopted, borrowed, mistranslated by clerks who could not spell, changed at immigration ports, and sometimes chosen simply because a family admired the sound of them. What a surname can offer is a thread, a place to start pulling, through parish records, land surveys, and if you're fortunate, surviving muster rolls that name your ancestors explicitly, sword in hand. And that, honestly, is where the real story lives. Not in the certainty of a title, but in the search for it. Picture, for a moment, the world these names came from. A muddy bailey at dawn, banners hanging heavy and wet in the cold air. Horses stamping in the mist. Men whose entire identity had come to rest on a strip of land, a coat of arms, a name that would outlive them by 7 centuries, carried by descendants who would never once hold a sword. Somewhere in a scriptorium, a clerk dips a quill and writes a name into a muster roll, not knowing that this single ink stroke would be the reason, hundreds of years later, a stranger typed that same word into a search engine, wondering if it meant something. It usually means more than one thing. That is the real lesson buried in medieval surnames. The same lesson genetics keeps teaching us about ancestry itself. Origins are rarely singular. They are layered, contested, partly documented and partly imagined, shaped as much by what families chose to remember as by what actually happened. A name that says knight might point to an actual belted warrior standing in a muddy field 800 years ago. It might point to a servant who lived beside one. It might point to nothing more than a family, centuries later, wanting to belong to a story larger than themselves. Maybe that is not a disappointing answer. Maybe it is the more honest one, that history does not hand down clean proof so much as it hands down clues, and it is up to each of us to decide how far we are willing to follow them. If your surname is on this list, that does not settle the question. It opens it. Somewhere behind it may be a knight, a tenant, a soldier, or simply a family that borrowed the shine of one. The only way to know is to look, and if stories like this make you want to keep looking, there is plenty more hidden in the names we carry without ever asking why.